Ahoy! The future is looking interesting for the third-person MOBA market. Once upon a time there used to be this little game called Paragon, which had a decent fan base and was thought to be competing with Smite, the other third-person MOBA, so really it was the only game in the genre that was comparable. But while Paragon had a reasonably sized fan base, it was not enough to keep the game alive in Epic's eyes, and when they blew up with Fortnite, they just straight up shut Paragon down. But when they did that, as a gesture of goodwill, they also released all of the assets from Paragon to be used by other people in any project they like. This resulted in spawning a bunch of Paragon clone projects. Many of these didn't survive very long, but a few are still around, and not all of them are equally well received. And one of these projects is Predecessor, and that's what you're looking at right now. Predecessor has had multiple stress tests at this point, and this is from the very recent one. I figured this time I'm going to dip my toes into it and just see how I feel about it, and I have to say I was very positively surprised. Now, I've played some of the other Paragon clones before and my experience with them was not exactly great. Therefore, my expectations going into Predecessor were pretty low. As such, I was extremely pleasantly surprised to find a functioning, fluid game. Now, I'm not saying Predecessor is perfect and ready for release tomorrow, but the core gameplay is absolutely there and the game is enjoyable. I was thinking of playing 1 or 2 rounds and I ended up playing 4 and sleeping way too late because of it. While today is not going to be a full review of the game because that wouldn't really be fair considering the game isn't out yet, I want to talk a little bit about my experience that I've had so far, the positive aspects of the game as well as the things that I think still need improvement before launch. One thing I want to say right at the beginning, because I know this one is very important to a lot of people, in Predecessor you have an item system, not a card system like Paragon had. Opinions on this will probably be split as usual. From a marketability perspective, however, I think this is a very important choice. Predecessor as a whole is not that easy to learn for someone who is new to the MOBA genre, and giving them a card system on top of it would just make it harder because then you have to unlock everything first, blah 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 blah. Having a simple, straightforward item system that they're familiar with from other games just takes away one of the steps in the learning curve, which in my opinion is good if you want to reach a lot of people with the game. Before I talk about other aspects of the technical side, let's talk a little bit about my experience going into the game. You basically have very limited options once you get into the menu. You don't have any tutorial type of stuff or anything like that yet, as far as I'm aware. You just go straight into the game. A tutorial for people new to the genre will absolutely be needed, but I'm sure the devs are aware and are working on that. It's just not finished yet. Once you get into the match, you select your role, and then there's a back and forth for picking the characters. It's a bit of a draft phase, which kind of feels unnecessary at the moment, but it is what it is. And then you're off to the match. There is an auto-buy function in the game for new players. I left that on because I had no idea about any of the items yet, figured that should make it a little bit easier. Of course, once you have more experience with the items, you're probably going to turn it off. There's a trail that guides you to the correct lane based on which role you picked, and that's pretty much all the hand-holding you get. By the way, at the moment there are 3 servers, EU, NA East and NA West, so you see me playing on 170, 190 ping. That is just because there are no Australian servers, but surprisingly, the ping didn't feel all too terrible. That's not to say that I didn't get roughed up for my first 3 matches, but I would actually blame that less on ping and more on versing experienced players. You can definitely tell that there are a lot of returning Paragon players who are probably more familiar with the characters than I am, and there are also probably quite a few players that are playing the game between the stress tests and various alpha, beta, whatever phases. So yeah, it takes a little bit to get into it and not feel like you're completely getting wrecked. But that is fine with me. While I have played Paragon before, I most certainly didn't sink all too many hours into it, so for me it was basically like playing brand new characters in a brand new game. After I found my footing with the jungle path and picked a pretty noob-friendly character in my opinion, Chimera, I was able to pick up the overall base mechanics and deal with people that clearly had more experience a fair bit better. In that regard, it definitely helped that the game felt very fluid. I think it makes mechanics a lot easier to pick up when the game has this instant response to what you're doing, and I didn't expect that from a game in a stress test phase yet, because this is usually something that many games struggle with basically until shortly before release, that they just feel a little bit clunky and not polished yet in regards to the animations and so on. And since we're already on the topic of graphics, the graphics, as you can clearly tell, look very nice for a game of this genre. There is, however, one thing that I think should be improved in regards to the graphics or visuals, and that is the field of view, the zoom level really. The current field of view cannot be adjusted as far as I'm aware, and it's extremely zoomed in. You're very close to your character. I think in a third-person MOBA that is not ideal because you want to have a little bit of vision behind you if someone is engaging on you. It just feels like your character is just covering too much of your screen. It just doesn't feel good. It just feels like it should be a little bit wider. And I know I'm not alone with this criticism. My friend that I was playing with had the exact same issue. I've also seen some Reddit posts about it, so I hope they tackle this one relatively soon. Smite pretty much has the ideal solution here already, where you can zoom out or in with your mouse depending on what your preferred zoom level is, rather than having to go into a menu and adjust an FOV slider. Being so zoomed in also meant that group combat was sometimes a little bit too chaotic for my taste. Overall it was fine, and when you were chasing people it was very easy to see what was going on, but especially when people were engaging from the side, it was very hard to keep an overview of the entire situation. Generally combat feels very nice. A lot of the abilities feel very satisfying and unique enough to set them apart. I like many of the mechanics and how fluid the cancels are, so overall I'm a pretty big fan of the combat. If there's one thing I'd like to see improved about it, it's the hit impact. Giving especially melee attacks a stronger visual response where enemies basically have a visual stagger that doesn't actually slow them down but just staggers the body of the character would go a long way in making the combat feel more satisfying and making it more clear when you hit someone. But I also know that for many developers this is one of the last things they work on, so it's understandable that it's not perfect at this stage yet. Something that is probably a bit more subjective is that the combat didn't really feel quite like Paragon to me, and I'm not entirely sure why that is. While I can't put my finger on what was different, ironically, I actually like the combat in Predecessor better. It's a mix of being relatively fluid and fast-paced, more so than Smite as well, for example, that really made me enjoy the fights that I had. What's also important about those fights is the map layout, because Paragon used to play a lot with verticality. I gotta say, there aren't that many places on the map that I've seen so far where verticality really plays a massive role, and in my opinion, there is more potential for it. I personally am not the biggest fan of any of the maps Paragon had, and I also think that Predecessor's map has a lot of room for improvement. I think the overall size is pretty decent because it's relatively small, allowing for very frequent rotations and ganks, which is cool. It makes the game more active and entertaining. But at the same time, I feel like there's so much untapped potential. There's quite a few places in the jungle where you actually can't go through, which kind of makes the jungle a bit annoying to navigate. Some stairs that you can't go up because you can't jump up the bottom part unless you have specific mobility abilities that allow you to do so. I personally would rather see a map that has less walls and more variation in verticality, so a lot of hills where you can't see the enemy behind the hill and they could just jump down on you or something. But instead of being walled off from going up there unless you go to the specific entrance, you could just walk up the hill and see if the mob camp behind it is up or if there's a player behind it. You just take that risk just without the vision. I think maxing the verticality all throughout the jungle could make it so that height could replace a fog of war and make jungling extremely interesting, but it would require pretty significant overhauls to the current jungle structure. And at the end of the day, this is of course a matter of preference as well. I just feel, again, that there's a little bit of untapped potential there. But if we're talking about jungling, we also need to talk about laning. One thing that I noticed is that you tend to use up a fair bit of mana even if you're not laning that aggressively, which is a design choice that I can understand, but it's something to get used to. You can't just aggressively clear with abilities most of the time, because in order to do that you would at least have to have some mana pots. A bigger nuisance to me personally is the heavy emphasis of last hitting. Last hitting, so getting the last hit on a mob in order to get gold and experience from them, is a mechanic that I think is just outdated and unfun. Smite doing away with the traditional last hit system and making it more of a bonus system, in my opinion, was a huge step up over League of Legends and is something that I think any third-person MOBA should adopt. As far as I can tell, in Predecessor, the mobs will still give you XP even if you don't last hit, but will only give you gold if you last hit them, and otherwise just give you straight up 0 gold. I'm not sure if this was partially a ping-related issue, but I found it very difficult and annoying to try and target the individual mobs, especially if the one that was lower health was not right at the front in order to get the last hits. I understand that some people value last hitting as a skill, but I think in a third-person MOBA, especially if the aim is not 100% polished on minions, it is not something that should be too heavily emphasized, just because it's already harder to do it than it is in a bird's view MOBA in the first place. Going the Smite route and just giving a reduced amount of gold for assists and then full gold for the last hits, in my opinion, is already a tried and tested model that works very well. There's also something else that I generally noticed, and that is that many characters felt a little bit unsatisfying to play in terms of mobility. Now, this may be a practice thing and I may just need to get used to it. It may partially be, again, a ping thing because it was harder for me to confirm abilities, but I felt that certain characters were equipped with significantly more mobility than others. I ran into multiple situations where enemies just felt almost impossible to chase in 1v1 scenarios, even in the jungle where they would just get over multiple walls way too quickly for me to respond to it. And I'm not quite sure if the kits of the characters that I was playing justify not having this level of mobility. Maybe this is something that resolves itself once I get more experience in the game, but it does somewhat remind me of the Smite meta where we ended up with pretty much every new guard getting mobility in order to compete and all the old guards that didn't have mobility not being played for the longest time. This is paired with the fact that every single character also gets a blink of flash, so every character has this same mechanic, but on a 5-minute cooldown. To me, that feels a little bit like a crutch solution to avoid balancing mobility on a larger scale. But who knows, that may already be a non-issue when the game comes out. On the topic of the game coming out, it is worth pointing out that the game is not finished yet. Many of the options in the main menu are not accessible at all. Information like scoreboards with more detailed stuff like damage dealt, etc. aren't available yet. There isn't any information on what you're upgrading when you level up abilities. It doesn't tell you what actually goes up. So there's a lot of work to be done. But that's not to say that a lot of it couldn't be done in an open beta version of the game or something similar. The much bigger question in the long run will be, can Predecessor become something of its own that is more than Paragon? As far as I'm aware, at the moment all the current characters are just the ones that already exist in Paragon, even though the developers have said that they're planning their own characters in the future. But having a frequent release schedule for new characters, keeping them interesting and also keeping the game balanced isn't an easy task, and this is all necessary if people are supposed to stick around long term. And we know that while Paragon had a dedicated fanbase, it also didn't exactly blow up. Maintaining an active MOBA community long term is a mammoth task that many companies have failed, and I really hope that Predecessor can get this right, because so far the game feels very promising, it feels very fun to play, it feels very satisfying to play, and I would like to enjoy it more in the future. I expect it to be a fair bit of a wait until that's possible, and I don't know if I can ever hope for Australian servers, but you can bet that whenever there are future opportunities to try it out, I will be there. For now, I think Predecessor is extremely promising, and any complaint that I have about it is something that can most certainly be solved in one way or another, and I'm hoping that they keep pushing in the right way and that this game makes it to a successful release. If you're interested in more videos of this type and info videos, please consider subscribing and clicking the bell, because on the topic of successful releases, tomorrow we'll be talking about Midnight Ghost Hunt. Feel free to let me know in the comments how you feel about Predecessor if you've played it, and how you feel about the prospect of potentially having some more competition in the 3D MOBA market. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope to see you for the next one soon. Duke Sloth, out.